Hello and good morning. I hope I am audible till the back. Okay. So in the last class we had talked about one corner of the Indo-Pacific by looking at the South Pacific Islands or forums like FIPIC, of which India is a part. In today's class we look at another country of the Pacific, but a country which is not necessarily remembered for being a country of the Pacific. A country which is generally considered to be what is called Eurasian country because it has such a large land mass. But we forget that Russia, the country about which we are going to talk today, also has a Pacific coast. So we will remember, linking from what we have learned so far, that when India says an inclusive Indo-Pacific, it keeps in mind a country like Russia. India would like to have a balanced approach towards Indo-Pacific as much as possible. And that's where we think that Russia is a Pacific country. All right. So then Russia may have been in news for a lot of reasons, and a lot of writing these days is only about Russia. So that is something that in UPSC preparation you will generally see. If something is happening, the newspapers would be full of coverage of that particular thing. We call such events unfolding events. So the unfolding events by nature, you cannot draw any particular conclusion. So that's why there is a flurry of opinion that you will find. So read what you want, but just understand that in all this, India's interests and India's position are of significance, right? So then rest is your prerogative, what you want to read, what you don't want to read, but don't miss out on India's position or India's interest. So when we talk about India-Russia relations, all of you now have an idea that this is a क्या कह सकते हैं इंडिया रशिया रिलेशंस के बारे में? स्पेशल एंड प्रिविलेज स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप. आज तो पढ़ के भी आए हैं लोग. ऑल राइट, वेरी गुड. सो दैट मीन्स दैट whatever you call it, it's a special relationship, and thereby the simple task is to understand why is it a special relationship. And then in the current context, the idea is, would this relationship remain to be a special relationship? Can we say that it would be a special relationship even in the future? So we can't predict. Yes sir, क्या आपका conclusion है? So we can't predict the future, but we can generally talk about the strains which may have developed, right? Because it is all about making choices. And when India is making choices, it has to calculate the cost and benefit of it. So right now it seems that India has sought to maintain this special relationship with Russia. And it has nothing to do especially with Russia, it has to do with what India generally stands for in its foreign policy. All right. So either be it non-alignment or multi-alignment or whatever name you give it, ultimate idea of India's foreign policy or many of the foreign policies is to preserve the space for independent decision making. Our engagements with multiple actors or few actors are precisely because of this, because these relations enable us in many ways in achieving our interests, right? So let's look at Russia. So if you look at Russia, it's an important country. There is no two way. Nobody can say that it's not an important country. So if you see far back in the 19th century, Metternich का नाम सुना है आपने? Metternich, one of the leading statesmen in Europe of the era of wars or balance of power. So Metternich said this about Russia. All right, Russia is never as strong as she appears, and it is never as weak as it appears. All right. So people either tend to overestimate Russia or underestimate Russia. Both of them are not a correct position to take. So even in the 19th century, Metternich is saying this. So even today that is correct. That Russia, if we may think that it is very strong, that expectation would be defeated by Russia itself. If we think Russia is very weak, that expectation would also be defeated by Russia itself. Russia is an important country. Similarly, if we see, on many instances, we can say that relations are thousands of years back. In the case of Russia, we can't say that. But we know that in the old times, visitors in the medieval times, visitors from Russia came to India. So sometimes we say that this relationship can be traced back to, for example, the visit of Nikitin to India. All right, he came and visited Bijapur. Anyone from Karnataka, if you are aware of the history of your state, this is one association with Russia. Nikitin visited Karnataka. And then if we see, generally this is the view on India-Russia relations. India and Russia have a long-standing relationship and an unshakable friendship, right? But friendship is in, unshakable is in inverted commas, because that's not going to be true for all times. But certainly for the current times and the past, this is true, that India and Russia have unshakable friendship. They are friends, right? And there is a reason for it. Friendship, interests of both New Delhi and Moscow with respect to their bilateral relationship with US and China have to be managed well. So they are friends, but they have other friends also. That's a simple meaning. So we are not as exclusive, perhaps, as maybe we were in the past, in the times of USSR. But we are still friends, meaning with changing times, friendship has continued. But there is a caveat that their foreign policies may be changing. And this is something that we have been talking about for at least last 10 years. That this is something that is happening. Russia is getting close to China. India is getting closer to United States, or certainly has opened up to United States more as compared to what was the case in the past. So speculations on the future of this relationship have been rife, and this is precisely because of the changing orientation of their foreign policies, right? So nobody is your friend or nobody is your enemy without any particular reason. It's primarily on the basis of interest. But in the case of India, Russia, we can also say that India becoming friends with US is not targeted at Russia. Russia becoming friends with China is not targeted at India, right? So we don't have relationship of animosity. The only question is how strong or weak our friendship can be, right? But we have friendly relations. That is something that we can clearly understand, right? And if you look at the relationship in terms of its areas of engagement, these are pretty traditional areas. They are not going to change in one day. So we see that their relationship are in the context of defense and security relations that they have. Their relationship are also in the context of the politics meaning geopolitics or changing orientation of these countries, and also economy, right? So traditional areas of engagements would be found in India-Russia relations also, right? So these are relations not made in heaven. These are relations made on earth. So again, a commonsensical approach is what is required. Commonsensical in the sense that when you talk about India-Russia relations, you don't straight away start talking about Ukraine, etc., etc. You first talk about what is it that exists between India and Russia, why they have friendly relations, right? So the simple idea is for me to remind you common sense, right? Always get hold of your common sense, because these days it is becoming very uncommon, right? Okay. So now let's look at the map of Russia. The map of Russia starts giving you some idea why this country is important. So what are we trying to understand? Why Russia is significant. So if you look at this map of Russia, it tells you that this is a country which spreads from the Pacific seaboard. It has the Arctic right north to it, and its landmass stretches till the European landmass. But it also is neighbors with Central Asian countries. It has an opening in the Caspian Sea. It has an opening in the Black Sea. It is neighbors with Mongolia. It is neighbors with China. And it is also neighbors with North Korea. So the first significance of Russia comes from the fact that it is world's largest country and nearly twice the size of the second largest country, which is Canada. So it's a vast country. But we also notice something. If you look at the map, the western part of Russia is dotted by cities or urban centers. So Russia's population, important cities are located towards Europe, all right, on the European landmass, towards the west of Russia. Capital Moscow, or cities like St. Petersburg, which are historically important cities, St. Petersburg or the capital Moscow. Now you see capital Moscow is very close to the European neighbors of Russia, for example, Ukraine. All right. So this is Russia that you will remember, and you can obviously see certain things. So basically, this is Vladivostok. Vladivostok means the easternmost city, and it is the easternmost port of Russia. Vladivostok, port in the Sea of Japan, which is in the Pacific, right, or East Sea. And this is the eastern region of Russia, and these are the islands which are called the Sakhalin Islands, right? And then the Kuril Islands, islands which are shared with Japan, or there are differences on the Kuril Islands with Japan. So Sakhalin, and then this is what is called the Kamchatka Peninsula, right? Kamchatka Peninsula. And largely this particular region of Russia is called the Far East of Russia, the typically Siberian region of Russia. So while Russia's resources are to the west, Russia's population is to the west, its resources are in the east, in a region which is sparsely populated, in a region which largely is bordered by China, right? And then this is the Bering Sea, and as you go further, this is the Bering Strait. Bering Strait separates China from United States, or the Alaskan territory of United States. All right. So then as you cross the Bering Strait, you find the Chukchi Sea, right? And then similarly in the Arctic, East Siberian Sea, Laptev Sea, Kara Sea, Barentus Sea, this is White Sea. So this is basically Russia's Arctic coast, the north of Russia, the Arctic coast. And then you have multiple European countries surrounding Russia. So simple general awareness of where Russia is located, who its neighbors are. So who are the neighbors of Russia? You have, in terms of shared land borders, North Korea, you have China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and then this is the Caspian Sea opening, this is Georgia, this is Azerbaijan, right? And then you go further towards the north, Ukraine, Belarus, all right? And then Latvia, Estonia, and then you have Finland, and then you have Norway, all right? So these are the neighbors that you will find that Russia has, European neighbors or Asian neighbors, East Asian neighbors, Central Asian neighbors, or marginal waters that Russia is surrounded by. So Russia as a country has interests to defend. What kind of interests? On the one hand, it has to defend its major core population centers, which are to the European side. On the other hand, it has to defend its resources, which are on the eastern side of Russia, or the Asian side of Russia, right? So it's a large country, and that's why it's difficult to understand it in simple sense, but still we can make some framework out of it. And this map simply shows you how Russia, if you juxtapose the map against China, or let's say against India, or against rest of Asia, Russia still would be larger, right? So Russia is a very large landmass. And some states are called Baltic states. All right. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These are the Baltic states, right? That's the simple idea. And here it's very clear that it's also a neighbor, only 90 miles across from United States. So we are talking about a unique country. And this map clearly tells you what we have already talked about, which are the regions surrounding Russia. And this is a port of Russia in the Baltic Sea. This territory, separated from Russia by other European countries, is held by Russia. Kaliningrad, as it is known as, the Kaliningrad. So that's an exclave of Russia, all right? An exclave of Russia which provides it an opening in the Baltic Sea. All right, चलिए इतना आपको पता चल गया. और now different regions. This region is called Caucasia. Caucasia has Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. All right, and this is of course Central Asia. Right, this is Central Asia, the 5 stans, 5 countries of Central Asia. Right, चलिए आगे चलते हैं. Simply reiterating things, we know a few things which have been in news about Russia. What has been in news about Russia? That Russia has traditionally been logged in a contestation with what we call West. West is a reference to United States and its Western European or continental European allies. So that's a large geostrategic contention that Russia has, right? Large geostrategic contention. Because Russia started expanding and then acquired large territories only in the 19th and early 20th century. So the question always for Russia is to how to defend its core. And if you remember the Second World War and the period after that, I hope you remember it. So in that particular period, what you will see is the primary geostrategic contention, as we call the transatlantic contention, was between United States and USSR, and the primary theater of that was Europe, meaning USSR wanted to expand westwards in terms of influence, and the Americans and its allies wanted to stop the westward expansion of USSR. And that's where you will see creation of military alliances, which we even talk about today. What kind of alliances? NATO. All right, so NATO became North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which came into existence in 1949. Today it has 30 countries as its members, and Brussels is where its headquarters is. All right, so that is NATO. That is one part of the alliance. As to in response to NATO, Russia also, or USSR also, created its own set of alliance, Warsaw Pact. All right, so this is geostrategic contention taking the form of military alliances, and that's why you would see either the partition of Germany into East-West or the creation of Berlin Wall. These are some examples of the Cold War rivalry between these two sides. Now 1991, the USSR collapses because of its own internal contradiction and external overreach, meaning it could not sustain competition with the Western Bloc in the long run, and it collapsed. So out of that collapse emerged certain successor states, and primarily Russia is the successor state of USSR. Why? Because Russia holds the permanent membership at the Security Council, which was with the USSR, and Russia holds the nuclear weapons, which the USSR had. No other post-Soviet country holds the nuclear weapons. So what we see is that in the 1990s, Russia has a confused state. First of all, economically, Russia is undergoing a situation wherein we see what is called shock therapy in Russia, meaning from a command control based economy to a free market economy. That transition is taking place in a very short span of time. So that transition period sometimes is referred to as a period in which Russia was undergoing what is called shock therapy, meaning it was a shock for its economy, right? Whole scale privatization of state controlled industries in Russia, in simple terms, is taking place. And why is this taking place? Because after the collapse of Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War, US has emerged as the most important power, and US and Russia is willing now to be friends with US. So US thinks that Russia can be brought into the Western sphere of influence. And Russia right now is not very sure what to do. So Russia is just reacting to the situation as it is happening. So economic crisis in Russia. In very cheap prices, on very cheap prices, the industries in Russia are sold, and that's the origin of creation of what are called oligarchs in Russia. बहुत सारे Russians बहुत अमीर हैं, right? Oligarchs in Russia, people who control important industries. So that is the period of their origin. That is where they bought industries at nominal prices, right? So few people controlling the economy of Russia. Now in Russia there is a debate in that particular period. While in economy there is obviously a crisis, bread is very expensive, inflation is very high, and transition is very chaotic. In politics and foreign policy there is a debate. What kind of country is Russia? So there is a rethinking, part of the confused identity of Russia. So one part believes that Russia should be an Atlanticist country, meaning Russia should move to more towards West, because Russia has more in common with West or the Western civilization. It should be an Atlanticist country. Some people say that Russia should be an Oriental country, meaning a country of the East. Its larger territories are towards East. So that is another point of view in Russian political debate. And there is a third point of view, that Russia is unique. So Russia should move towards its Eurasian identity. It should establish itself as a Eurasian country, a country with its own vast land mass through which it straddles. So that is three strands of opinions. Russia being an Atlanticist country which is going towards the West, being friends with the West, or Russia being an Oriental country, meaning Russia largely defining its interest towards the East, or Russia being a Eurasian country, a unique country which combines both the East and the West. It is both European as well as Asian. So that's the debate that is going on in Russia. What would happen? And Russia's political leadership at that point in time is weak. All right. So recently, Mr. Gorbachev, the last Secretary General of the Communist Party in Russia, or the last president of, let's say, USSR, passed away, who presided over the collapse of Soviet Union. So the gentleman who had rebelled against Mr. Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, was the president in this particular period. सुना है आपने नाम बोरिस येल्सिन का? So Boris Yeltsin is a interesting figure. You would still find a lot of videos of him in an inebriated state, a drunken state. है ना? उनको पीने की काफी शौक था. So foreign policy चलाने के लिए time नहीं था उनके पास. So he rebelled decisively and then separated Russia from USSR, and that was the beginning of collapse of Soviet Union. But after that what? After that comes the difficult time. So in difficult time he was not an adequate leader. So then in 1999 he brings in his government a gentleman called Vladimir Putin. Right? So Vladimir Putin from lower ranks now climbs to the position of Prime Minister and then virtually becomes the successor of Mr. Boris Yeltsin. And in 2000, Vladimir Putin becomes the president of Russia. In the year 2000, Vladimir Putin becomes the president of Russia. So Vladimir Putin has two sets of realizations. One, that the period of USSR was not all bad. All right, because he was product of that time. We are all products of our time. ऐसा कुछ यूनिक नहीं होता हम में. हम सभी वही सोच रहे होते हैं जो हमारे समय में हमको दिखाया जाता है या जैसे हम बड़े होते हैं. So that is one influence, the Soviet influence on Vladimir Putin. And the realization that at least at the time of Soviet Union, USSR was a great power. It was respected. Right? And post-Soviet period generally is remembered, or Soviet period is generally remembered by the older generation nostalgically. There were no shortages, खाने पीने के लिए चीजें थी, right? People were neither too rich nor too poor. So these kinds of things are remembered by them. But certainly Vladimir Putin understands that Russia is a great power, and at the time of USSR that was the case. And second thing, he also understands that now USSR cannot be brought back, meaning what USSR was cannot be brought back. So then there has to be a new way of engaging with the world. So the intention is still the same, establishing Russia as a global power. Right? That's what Vladimir Putin's objective has been, establishing Russia as a global power, which it was. Right? And re-establishing the respect that Russia deserves. And his way of doing it is by defining Russia's core interests in terms of defense of its territory, developing Russia's capabilities, scientific, industrial as well as defense capabilities, and re-establishing Russia's traditional partnerships. Russia's traditional relations, even while engagements with the US went on. Right? Russia kept on engaging with the US, but the clear objective was to understand the difference of Russia, or the difference that Russia can make, that it is a different country. It is not going to be easily a part of the Western alliance or the Western bloc, right? So then we see that when Russia defines its interests, it says that it has a strategic sphere of influence. It is a traditional strategic sphere. And this is defined in terms of the region surrounding Russia. That Russia not only has control over its own territory, but for the core interests of its own territory, it has a strategic sphere of influence, which is generally regions surrounding Russia, meaning what is to Russia's west or what is to Russia's south. These are generally spheres of influence of Russia, with a special focus on its western neighbors, countries with whom it shared close borders, right, or countries which were in close proximity to Russia. So that then meant that one significant point of contention which developed between the West and Russia was on the issue of expansion of influence of the West towards Russia. In concrete terms, eastwards expansion of NATO, or even for that matter, European Union. So that clearly became gradually a point of contention, whereby Russia viewed or saw the eastward expansion of NATO or even eastward expansion of European Union as an expansion of their influence in its strategic backyard, its strategic sphere of influence. So when this happens, generally it is a matter of diplomacy, that you try and engage with each other and try and develop an understanding of each other's core interests, each other's core understanding. And that is something that we will see happens. For example, Russia was now a member of G7, group of 7 countries which became G8 after the inclusion of Russia. Russia was included in G8 in 1998. So either through the platforms like G8 or through its separate dialogue with US, diplomacy continues to be the past. Russia is also part of G20. So that continues. The effort to develop an understanding with the West, with the Europe. But what is very clear, that for Russia, its core interests are its core interests. It is not going to compromise. So the space for compromise was very less, especially in the face of the fact that West generally, or United States generally, couches its foreign policy in normative rhetoric, meaning US would start talking about human rights or democracy, etc. Right? And Russians don't like it. Russians say that we don't tell you to what to do in your neighborhood. We don't tell you what kind of governments you should have. So what right you have to tell us? Meaning Russia increasingly viewed the West's approach to be interventionist. All right. So these kinds of differences then start emerging. If you see 2011 to 10-11, Russia becomes involved in Syria. All right. Syrian government. Syria is in West Asia. Map में आपने atlas में देखा होगा. You would be able to locate it. So Syria faces a civil war situation. Now in this civil war, on the one hand there is the Syrian government, on the other hand there are various kinds of rebels. Rebels who would like to move towards democracy, or also rebels who have elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, meaning outrightly fundamentalist and terrorist inklings. So Russia then becomes the major government which supports the Syrian government. Russia, Iran support the Syrian government. So now you would see that some fault lines are developing in conflict situations where US and West are on one side and Russia is on the other side. So Russia and Iran help the Syrian government. West, US and its allies, European allies, oppose the Syrian government. So that is the first where we will see that the fault lines are drawn. It becomes clear that on important matters, Russia and Western countries may not have a common position. All right, the potential of polarization is there. Even before that, in 2008, Russia had attacked or invaded Georgia, because Georgia also had started developing close relations with West or had shown an intention of joining. Georgia kahan hai? Did we see it on the map? Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Caucasus, another neighbor of Russia, another neighbor which came out of the USSR. So Georgia is a very small country, and Georgia had started developing relations with the West, and Georgia also had shown inclination to join NATO. So that was a small indicator what Russia would do. So Russia had invaded Georgia and separated one of its territories. All right. And since then, that particular part of Georgia is recognized as an autonomous territory by Russia. So 2008, Georgia war, right? War in Georgia. 2011 onwards, Syria. These are examples of how differences are developing. Differences are there, right? And in this time, you will see China playing more or less a disinterested role. All right, China is not openly siding with anyone, but broadly it has similarities with Russian position. What similarity? That China also is a country which is not exactly a fit with the West. All right, it's an Eastern country. It defines its interest differently. Then what we see is another indication of what was to happen came in 2014. 2014. हाँ हाँ बिल्कुल बिल्कुल आपको पता है, मैं डाउट नहीं कर रहा कि आपको पता है, बट आई एम ओनली ट्राइंग टू शो यू द पैटर्न एंड व्हाई इट हैपेंड. So then Russia invades Crimea, Crimean Peninsula, and not only that, it conducts a referendum and annexes Crimea, right? Annexes Crimea. So that was one. Now what do you do? So then at that time, sanctions on Russia started. Russia was expelled from, let's say, G7. All right. So G8 again became G7 because Russia was expelled by Western countries. So the efforts which were ongoing to bring about certain degree of understanding between the West and Russia, in a way, started showing signs of strain, that it is not going anywhere. And Russia asserted that it has core interests which it would defend aggressively. So that is how you see either Russia invading Georgia or Russia invading Ukraine and annexing the Crimean Peninsula, right? Because Crimean Peninsula is important for its Black Sea ports. In any case, part of Crimea was leased by Russia from Ukraine. Now Russia said no leasing, etc. This is our territory. So they annexed it. So then again, series of sanctions. Europe put sanctions on Russia. Sanctions may take a lot of forms. For example, travel freeze, travel ban on certain officials which are directly involved in those kinds of activities. And then you have efforts made to dissuade Russia from annexing Crimea, but it did not happen. What happened was a series of diplomatic efforts which only ended up recognizing the de facto situation, meaning no change in Russia's position on Crimea, right? With French mediation, European Union mediation, there were series of Kyiv talks, all right? Kyiv understanding, Kyiv agreement which is reached. And this is simply to maintain further peace because you cannot further escalate, right? And then gradually what is happening in 2000 and by 2020, the differences are as yet becoming more and more serious, meaning a common understanding is not being developed. What is happening? That these two sides are now moving in opposite directions, specifically the United States and Russia, right? How is this clear? If you see the US president 2016 to 2020, Donald Trump, was personally cordial towards Russia, right? Was personally very cordial towards Russia. But the larger political debate in US was not very cordial towards Russia. Meaning it was very clear identification in US politics that Russia is the next, or Russia continues to be a traditional adversary. So even though Mr. Trump wanted to have good relations with Mr. Putin, it would not translate into US and Russia entering into a period of, let's say, détente or a period of understanding. It did not happen because their interests are too divergent. So one thing that happened which raised the temperature is the accusations on Russia for interfering in US elections. 2016 elections, there is the accusation that Russian hackers meddled into American politics to the extent of determining the final outcome, where Hillary Clinton lost and Donald Trump won. So now you see this debate starts getting defined in terms of, again, the rhetoric of the Cold War. Authoritarianism versus democracy. Liberal democracies versus authoritarian regimes. All right. And in the time of Crimea, China took a sympathetic position vis-a-vis Russia. Simultaneously, what you would see is during Donald Trump's presidency, China's differences with Russia came to the fore. The differences were there, but now they are much more harshly put in the open. Right? So this then creates a situation where Russia already is moving on a collision path with the West, and China also now has the same trajectory. So Russia and China gradually come together, and they had been partners, but after 2014 the process hastened, right? It was speeded up. So they started taking a common position. Right? So then what you will see is, for example, some of the understandings reached between USSR, post-USSR, Russia and US are now allowed to expire. For example, something called the INF Treaty, right? Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So that is the indication that diplomacy is failing. INF Treaty is allowed to expire, all right, or is not extended. So then what we see that 2020, we were talking about COVID-19, but this issue was still there. What issue? The eastwards expansion of NATO or European Union. So let's come back to Ukraine. In Ukraine, what happened in 2014 was largely due to failure of both sides to prevail, meaning neither the West could prevail very clearly nor Russia could prevent Western influence. So what happened? In Ukraine, first of all, there have been always two sorts of opinions, one largely pro-Russian, another largely pro-Western. Specifically, if you look at the geography of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine has a larger proportion of Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic population, right? And western part of Ukraine is a mixed bowl. So we have differences in opinion. So the government of the day at that point in time, 2014, decided to not vote in favor of joining European Union, or decided to shelve its efforts to join the European Union. So it was a pro-Russian government. And then this pro-Russian government, when it decides not to or freeze its attempt to join the European Union or join the NATO, faces a protest which are called Maidan protests. All right, Maidan protests, or there is a term called colored revolution, which generally is talked about. So the protests were directed against a pro-Russian government, right? And how is it pro-Russian? I will repeat again, because it froze attempts to move towards NATO or move towards European Union. But now, under popular protests, the pro-Russian president has to leave. He leaves. So Russia says that these protests have been sponsored by CIA, have been sponsored by the West. All right. And then that is where Russia decides to move and take back Crimea, right? Because now Russia can't control or can't influence the domestic politics of Ukraine, or West is also getting involved in terms of public opinion or influencing the public opinion. And then when Vladimir Zelensky becomes the president, he is staunchly in favor of West, or certainly not liked by the Russians. All right. So Crimea already was annexed. Now in 2021, talks continued. For example, you will see till January 2022, there were talks between Russia, US. There was meeting between the president of Russia and president of US. And Russia's demands were simple, that eastwards expansion, there should be guarantees on eastwards expansion of NATO. All right. So primarily it was a standoff between two states which were traditional adversaries, USA and Russia. So what is Ukraine's fault? Ukraine's fault is that it became the battleground of these geostrategic interests. Ukraine's fault is that its geography is such that it is a neighbor of Russia, B, it also has an orientation towards Europe, and thereby it's a suitable country when it comes to deciding whose influence in this region would run large. All right. So you can look at Ukraine itself in two parts, eastern and western. All right. So Russia would try to have influence as much as possible over the entire country, if not possible, at least on its eastern part, and west, if it wants to move close to Russia, would see Ukraine to be important, right? So Ukraine is cursed by its geography, right? So you would see eastward expansion of NATO had been taking place after the collapse of Soviet Union. So you see some countries which were either US allies, which were either Soviet allies, or Eastern European countries which were with Soviet Union earlier joined the NATO, right? So this is the list of countries. Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, Latvia, Poland, Hungary, they had joined the NATO. And remember, Warsaw is the capital of Poland, all right? Warsaw Pact. So the situation had been changing. Eastward expansion of NATO had been taking place, and Russia said it has to draw a line somewhere. Otherwise, if the bordering countries like Ukraine, you see, is the last one. Now with the inclusion of Ukraine, you would have a large country which is a part of NATO on the borders of Russia. So then Russia decided to draw a line and decided to do it in a very crude way. And that is what Russia does. Russia is not as sophisticated as the United States. It would not generate a debate on democracy, sovereignty, human rights at the Security Council. So it did what? It mobilized troops. So troop mobilization had already taken place in January. And US was predicting that its intelligence sources are saying that an invasion is inevitable. Russia is going to invade. But Russia is saying, no, we don't have any plan of invading. We are only conducting a military exercise. All right. And that's a domestic development. And US gave this intelligence to Ukraine also. So Ukraine also rejected it. Ukrainian President Mr. Zelensky also rejected it. That this is nothing but warmongering. We don't see any possibility of Russian invasion. So diplomacy is taking place at the same time. Long-term fault lines are there on the basic issue of sphere of influence, eastward expansion of Russia, of NATO, and Russia's opposition to it. And mobilization of troops is giving an indication, but then at that point in time nobody could think that a Russia which is becoming weaker. Why is it weaker? Because its population is shrinking, because its economy is not well diversified. So Russia would not risk a war at this particular stage. And this is where you understand that things like war can never be predicted. We can only signal that, for example, if there is a large scale mobilization of troops, arms, weapons, it may lead to war. All right. So that's why on the LSE, if there is large scale deployment of troops, we always think that it may lead to war. Nobody can for sure say whether there would be war or there wouldn't be war, right? But these are the indications. So then in the month of February, Russia launched a invasion of Ukraine, which it said is not an invasion, it's not war, it's simply a special exercise, all right? Meaning it's a very limited incursion that Russia is taking place. Russia did not want to define it in terms of war. At that point in time, Russia also calculated that it would be short, swift, we will win, we will declare victory and we will come back. Now Russia is also learning that war is unpredictable. All right, you cannot always ensure what you want, right? And this is not happening without the help of NATO. So somebody had asked me in January, February, would the NATO be involved? I had said yes, NATO would be involved. So they said, no, NATO would not be involved, etc. And then later on they said, see, NATO is not involved. So I said, what do you mean by involvement of NATO? If you mean that NATO troops would come, of course NATO is not involved. But if you see financial assistance, arms, ammunition, intelligence sharing with Ukraine, Ukraine can't withstand Russia without the help of West. So NATO is involved. NATO has announced a special package for Ukraine, not directly but indirectly, and in some sense decisively. So a war is going on, and that is what it is all about. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't read much into it. So this is how it happened. Now we see that there are certain pieces of projects which were in news. So this is basically the Nord Stream pipeline. Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. So this only simply tells you another piece of complexity, which is what? That Europe would always be in dilemma. Europe never wanted US and Russia to go on a collision path. Why? US तो Atlantic के उस पार thousands of miles away है. Europe shares a border with Russia. Alright, it is Europe which shares a border with Russia. And secondly, Europeans have enjoyed prosperity. Europeans have enjoyed constant energy supplies. Europe has moved towards green energy future because it could buy cheap Russian gas. So that dependency was always there. So Europeans understood that there is a complex interdependence between itself and Russia. So European countries were always in favor of diplomacy, that there should be some understanding, some detente between US and Russia. It should not go on a collision course. So one thing is this, the pipeline, gas pipeline from Greifswald in Germany to Vyborg in Russia. All right, from Russian seaboard to German seaboard, the pipeline which has been created. Now this is an important source of supply to Germany of Russian gas, and this is very, very important if you see. So this was Nord Stream 1, the first one, Vyborg to Greifswald, and then Russia was involved bankrolling the second larger pipeline, right, from Ust-Luga to Greifswald in Germany, Nord Stream 2. So there was another reason why people said that there would not be a war, because Russia was already bankrolling this major project. And remember, gas, hydrocarbons is an important major source of income for the Russians. So any reasonable person would say, why would Russia do something which would economically harm it, right? When it is bankrolling Nord Stream 2, why would it act aggressively? It would not. So that's why analysts fail, experts fail. And that's why I always say expertise is not required in this examination, because experts most of the times in international relations fail. जब कुछ हो जाता है तो उसके बाद flurry of articles. So you can see the difference. Articles written before and article written after. When something happens, it is all about explanation and projection, right? But nobody can predict exactly what would happen. Only people can have reasonable guesses. So, from the perspective of UPSC, UPSC may simply ask a question like, Nord Stream 2 has been recently in news. What is it? Right? It's a gas pipeline built by Russia to connect with European market, right? So between Russia and Germany, right? Again, this is in news. Why is this in news? because of leakage, right? So people are saying that there has been, Russia is saying that it may be an act of terrorism, all right? It may be an act of subversion, it is part of the war. So again, it's happening very, very far away. So the only thing that you should keep in mind is what is Nord Stream, right? But at that point in time, it gave you an example of how complex are relations between countries, right? Europe cannot openly antagonize Russia, did not want to openly antagonize Russia, because it relied on cheap supply of, an easy supply of oil and gas from Russia. All right, Europeans could not do that. Europeans would not have wanted it to happen, but it happened because, unfortunately for Europe, it is again cursed by geography. It is between two large powers which are on the collision course. On the one hand, it has a border with Russia. On the other hand, there is United States, which thinks that दुनिया में कहीं पे कुछ भी हो रहा है, उसमें उसका stand बनता है, right? So that is the problem with the US, that either we expect too much of the US or US expects too much from itself, all right? So it would go to far-flung places, defining it as part of its national interest, or it would start selling democracy, that we stand for democracy. But US would never promote democracy, let's say in Saudi Arabia, all right? US does not promote democracy in Saudi Arabia, or does not very openly talk about human rights in many of the countries where human rights situation is bad. So that is great power politics. So from all this discussion, we can only learn one line. What is that one line? Great powers have only interests, all right, their own interests. They are not interested in you. They are interested in their own interests. And sometimes great powers have very short span of attention. आज इस चीज पे ध्यान दे रहे हैं, कल को कुछ और हो जाएगा, वहां चले जाएंगे. All right. So 20 years in Afghanistan, and now what is happening in Afghanistan is not even in news, right? 2021, everything about Afghanistan. Now everything about Russia and Ukraine. So UPSC is not going to ask everything about this, and if it is going to ask anything about this, it is going to be very, very simple. So let's now further look at what has happened here. So what kind of questions does UPSC ask? So after telling you this story, many people are interested, if I don't know the background, how will I understand? Well, if you read regularly, you will get enough background. If you want to become an expert, then you need to read more. But a common sense would be helpful. Look at the question that UPSC asked. 2014, what had happened? Can you tell me what had happened in 2014? Crimean annexation of Crimea by Russia. Chalo, theek hai. So then again newspapers would have talked a lot about that. UPSC never asked a question in mains, and in pre-examination this is what UPSC asked. So this is a location based question which we can say is inspired by IR or developments in IR, and simply awareness is being sought. So this is the regions which are known for conflict, long-standing conflicts, major points of conflicts, and where are they located? So Chechnya, Russian Federation; Darfur, Mali; Swat Valley, Iraq. So UPSC is simply telling you, tell us of what you know, right? It is not asking you any technical question. है ना कि Nord Stream कैसे बनी थी? How is gas transported through a pipeline? UPSC is not asking you this. UPSC is asking you this. So answer is C, 1 and 3 only, which are correctly matched. Chechnya is in Russian Federation. Darfur, कहाँ है Darfur? Darfur is in Sudan. All right. There was a long-standing humanitarian conflict even in Sudan. Darfur was a place where large-scale massacres took place. Right. So it was in news. आप news पढ़ रहे हैं तो आपने उस समय दारफूर के बारे में सुना होगा. And Swat Valley. This is from where Malala Yousafzai comes from. सुना है आपने Malala Yousafzai के बारे में? This is the origin of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. All right, not the Afghan Taliban, but the Pakistani Taliban. So Swat Valley right next to India. So simple awareness is what UPSC asked you, 2014. Right, moving on. Then UPSC starts asking you this kind of question. 2014, what has happened? What kind of conflicts are going on? Majorly at in that particular Crimea is in news. What is it that UPSC is asking you? From a close by region. I can't say that this is how UPSC does it, but I can only show you that this is what happens, right? Black Sea and Caspian Sea, Black Sea and Mediterranean, Gulf of Suez, Mediterranean Sea, Gulf of Aqaba and Dead Sea. Some people are saying Black Sea and Caspian Sea, some people are saying B. So obviously B is the correct answer. And Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea are nothing but large, prominent geographical features. These are not small lakes. So large, prominent geographical features, that which is visible, that which should be known. If you don't know anything special about, for example, whether Vladimir Putin is dying or not, whether Vladimir Putin uses a body double or not, why Vladimir Putin's hand does not move, alright? Whether you know that or not is of no concern to UPSC, but whether you know certain basics or not. Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea, that is where Turkey is located, right? So that's why this conflict invites you to look at the map. And what map? First of all, which areas are in news? So you have Ukraine, alright? And on the other hand, you have Russia, right? So at least these two things you should be noticing, right? So now there are lots of places which are being talked about. So first thing that you will notice is what is major, what is most fundamental. Most fundamental is features like Black Sea, or features like which are the countries with whom, let's say, Ukraine shares a border, right? Russia, it shares a border with Russia, alright? And Belarus and Poland and Hungary and Romania and Moldova, right? So ये आपको देखने की जरूरत है कि किसके साथ ये बॉर्डर शेयर कर रहे हैं, करता है ये देश, ऑलराइट? एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स प्लेसेस लाइक ओडेसा, एक फिल्म है ओडेसा फाइल्स, ऑलराइट? सो ओडेसा is simply important because it's a port location. It's an important port location in Ukraine on the Black Sea. And this is the larger region of the Crimean Peninsula. On Crimean Peninsula, you will find ports like Yalta, Yalta Conference. Alright? Sevastopol, another important port location on the Black Sea. That's it, nothing more than that. And then, if certain regions have been news, for example, this Kerch Peninsula was in news. So Sea of Azov, all right, Sea of Azov, another minor sea of or minor waters of Black Sea. And then some cities which have been regularly in news, for example, Donetsk, Luhansk, right? अब इस समय Zaporozhia, right? Kherson, that's it. And then ये भी माइनर है, ये भी जरूरी नहीं है कि आप ये याद कर लें, पर आप जनरली न्यूज़पेपर देख रहे हैं, न्यूज साइकिल देख रहे हैं, तो ये अपने आप याद हो जाता है, अपने आप आपको याद हो जाता है. दूसरा, नाउ व्हाट इज मेजर? सम रिवर्स, फॉर एग्जांपल दिस इज द नीप्र, ऑलराइट, द नीप्र रिवर, which is important because on the capital of Dnipro you have the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. So the Dnipro originates in Russia. Alright, it originates in Russia, it flows through Belarus, and then it crosses Ukraine. Alright, Dnipro. सुना होगा आपने, right? For example, it may be one of the geographical markers. रशिया क्या चाहेगा? एक रशिया पर्टिकुलर इलाके तक इन्फ्लुएंस चाहेगा. सो नीप्र कैन बी वन फ्रंट लाइन, वन बॉर्डर, बट नीप्र इज एन इंपॉर्टेंट रिवर, ओरिजिनेट्स इन द माउंटेन्स ऑफ रशिया and then flows through Belarus and then in Ukraine, right? And there is another river called the Desna River. Desna River was in news also because of fighting in this region, because of it flowing through the region of Kharkiv. So Desna flows from Russia to Ukraine, all right? So this is something that you should be noticing, and of course you will try and notice who are the neighbors of Russia also. That is the only thing that you need to do. And then now moving forward, you go to another map and you look at the Black Sea. All right, Black Sea. And in the Black Sea, you will notice a certain things. Which are the countries surrounding the Black Sea? So Turkey, then Georgia, Russia, then Ukraine, then Romania, then Bulgaria. These are the major countries surrounding the Black Sea. And then you will notice some important parts of Black Sea, right? क्योंकि बड़े मैप पे आपको ये दिखने लगा, कभी कभी लोग ये भी दिखा देंगे. So first of all, if you see, Dnipro is flowing into the Black Sea. And then you have the Karkenit Bay. If at all UPSC wants to make it difficult, it will expect you to have paid some attention to the region closely. So Karkenit Bay, Sea of Azov, Tagnarok Gulf, these are all minor margins of the Black Sea, right? But highly unlikely. Sea of Azov is fine. Sea of Azov is a larger feature close to Crimean Peninsula, close to the Kerch Strait, which was in news. So rather than obsessing even with this, you simply keep it as simple as possible. So one thing that you would notice is these important passageways. Just as in the Indian Ocean region, we talked about certain critical access ways, because these are important from the perspective of passage of global trade, right? And notice in paper 1, UPSC asked about the significance of isthmus and straits, right? And how do you answer that question? That global trade passes through it, global energy flows pass through it. So these kinds of locations are important. Bosphorus. Bosphorus connects the Black Sea with Sea of Marmara, all right? And then Dardanelles, the Dardanelles Strait. So Dardanelles Strait connects the Sea of Marmara with the Mediterranean, and within the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, all right? Aegean Sea. So this is Dardanelles, Bosphorus and Dardanelles, two of the most important critical access ways in the current time, because any trade of Russia or Russian ports in the Black Sea, if they want to reach the international markets through ocean, would have to pass through Bosphorus and Dardanelles, controlled by Turkey, right? Or any trade from Ukraine, if it wants to reach the European market through ocean or rest of the world through ocean, it will pass through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. So that's why you would have seen that recently, most recently, Russia and Ukraine with UN and Turkey have reached an agreement on what? On keeping the Black Sea ports open for the export of wheat, fertilizers, and let's say sunflower seeds, right? Because these are some of the important products which come from this particular region. And why is Turkey involved? Because Turkey is a neighboring country in this region, controls the access to Black Sea. So that's why you would have seen Turkey is also involved in the agreement which Russia, Ukraine, UN and Turkey have reached for opening the ports in the Black Sea, even in the context of the conflict. All right. तो ये आपको नोटिस करने की जरूरत है at most from the perspective of UPSC. If you look at the questions, right? Mariupol for a particular time was in news. Russia put a lot of effort for controlling Mariupol because this is the port through which Ukraine mainly exported wheat and steel to the European market, right? So Mariupol was also in news. Mariupol in the Tagnarok Gulf, largely in the Black Sea region. So जब भी कुछ हो रहा है, कुछ locations के बारे में news sources अपने आप बार बार बात करेंगे. So first you hear, read, and then you simply go and mark it on the atlas. That's it. Or make a note कि ये कहाँ पे located है. In the age of Google, it has not become difficult. Then what has happened? 30th September this year, Russia sponsored a referendum in some regions of Ukraine. Now it is very clear that Russia is not making at the advance as quickly as it would have wanted. Ukrainians are fighting. So Ukrainians की वीर गाथा है अपनी जगह पे. Whether you like Zelensky or you like Putin, that's your problem. But simply, when UPSC has to ask something, it will ask you about these reasons, right? So Crimea was already annexed by Russia in 2014. Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Luhansk. These are the reasons which have been annexed by Russia. Now annexation by Russia means what? That now Russia defines it as part of its own territory. And then why is it important? Because Russia has said that it is open to using any kinds of weapon to defend its territorial integrity. मतलब वैसे भी रशिया पे कोई इन्वेड करने नहीं जा रहा था. Nobody would think of invading Russia. So Russia has extended its own territory, meaning changing the goalpost. अब अगर Ukraine makes an effort to liberate these territories, that is also a threat to Russia's territorial integrity. If the West helps Ukraine in liberating these territories, that is also a help to Ukraine and a help against Russia's territorial integrity. So then Russia has made it very clear that I know that you are not going to invade us, but I am challenging you. Alright, I am challenging you. Now, if you want to stand for principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, come liberate these regions. Alright. So one, strategically, this is something that Russians would have wanted at the minimum, to create a buffer zone. A buffer zone between itself and Ukraine. In the worst case scenario, if Ukraine joins NATO, worst case scenario, then too, the Russians have a territorial buffer from its mainland, between its mainland and Ukraine, or prospectively Western controlled territories. So that is something that Russians would have wanted tactically, controlling a large chunk of Ukraine, which they can use as buffer. So using as buffer would have meant recognizing, for example, Luhansk and Donetsk were earlier recognized as independent republics by Russia. Now Russia has annexed them, made them part of its own territory. So now Russia is escalating, meaning it is challenging. Do what you want to do, right? So then Russia is indicating that this is where it would be satisfied. Now the next step of diplomacy would be about recognizing the control of these regions by Russia, right? So Russia has expanded its territory, and then Crimea has been important for Russia. So this provides a clean corridor, a territorial corridor. Annexation of this region provides Russia a clear corridor between its own territory and Crimea. Alright. So there is a territorial connect now between Crimean Peninsula and Russia, Russia's territory, Russia's mainland. So generally यही देश चाहते हैं, टेरिटरी कंट्रोल करना चाहते हैं जो उनके लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है, इंश्योर करना चाहते हैं उनकी सिक्योरिटी, और इन सिंपल टर्म्स this region is devoid of any major geographical feature which can act as a barrier, a strategic barrier. For example, we have Himalayas to our east. So that acts as a natural barrier, first line of defense. This part of Europe has no defining barriers. So Russia always thinks that it is vulnerable for or vulnerable to a land-based attack from European mainland into its own core, and this region, which is a plain region which does not have any major geographical barriers, is its large vulnerability. So that's why it wants to control it, right? And remember, I am not saying whether it is right or wrong. I am only saying that this is the fact. These are the facts. Whether it is right or wrong would be a matter of value, right? So for me, for example, if you ask my personal opinion, this is wrong. This is plain wrong. Even if West is wrong, Russia is also wrong. Russia cannot be, you cannot justify what Russia is doing unless you are a votary for use of power in international relations. है ना, बहुत सारे लोगों को शक्ति का इस्तेमाल बहुत पसंद है, पर शक्ति का ज़्यादा इस्तेमाल would also lead to destruction, right? So we are on the brink of a nuclear war if it continues. Now, secondly, if one country does it, then other large country which can do it would use it as a justification. For example, India-China border. China claims a lot of territories which are of India. And if you say that, let's say, place India in the place of Ukraine and place China on the place of Russia, then would you still say that what Russia is doing is right? We would not like this to happen to us. All right? So some people say that this means that we can emulate Russia and we can take back POK. All right? Some people would like to say this. Whether you do it or not, I don't have any personal opinion on that. But remember, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So then readiness for nuclear conflict is the most important barrier that we have to cross. जिस दिन हमने ये चिंता बंद कर दी कि न्यूक्लियर वॉर हो सकता है, हम कर सकते हैं, मिलिटरली ये काम कर सकते हैं, right? But remember, but don't forget that there is also China on the other side, which may also have its own justifications for why it would like or it claims certain Indian territory. So how do we criticize it? On the matters of principles. And that's why you would see what India does is never let go of certain principles. That's why it cannot openly say that what Russia is doing is right. Because if India does that, then it becomes a precedent, right? Then what right would we have to complain against the actions of other adversarial countries on the same matter, right? So that's why, what is India doing? On the one hand, India has interests. So India is trying to balance its interests with principles, right? It is taking the two at the same time. So लंबी कहानी हो गई, right? But we have talked about Ukraine, Russia to the extent that we could have. There is a question online. Sir, many say that during war, Finland joined NATO and it's a big loss for Russia. While others say that Russia is obsessed with its link with warm waters and thus focuses more on countries having access to warm waters. Thus, Finland being in north doesn't matter to it. Sir, what should be the right way of looking at to it? First of all, it is a question related with Russia's view. All right, Russia's view. You don't have anything to do with Russia's view. So it's true, all that you are saying, Adishwar, is true, that one traditional way of looking at Russia's interest has been that Russia wants expansion towards warm water ports, because most ports of Russia are not operable throughout the year. For example, the eastern ports of Russia in the Pacific are not operable in the months of winter. They freeze. So that is one weakness of Russia, and that's why Russia's naval power is not comparable to US. All right? So Russia has an interest in acquiring a foothold in such locations where it can have access to warm water ports. So that's why for Russia, Black Sea is much more important. Black Sea is much more important because it gives Russia an access to all weather ports. It makes it mobile. That's why Russia's interest in Syria, because Syria is in Mediterranean basin, right? So that's one way of looking at it. So whether it does not care about Finland joining the NATO, but just see, Russia can't do anything about Finland joining the NATO even if it wants to, because it is already overstretched in Ukraine. You are already fighting a war in Ukraine. Now going to Finland would mean inviting an open war with NATO. So it is part of Russia's calculation. No good general opens all front of wars, right? You choose your enemies and you choose your focus. So the answer is very simple, that it is true. Russia would like to control warm water ports because that is one geographical weakness that it has. Two, Finland is not as important in terms of strategic vulnerabilities of Russia as Ukraine, and Ukraine is already involved in a direct military conflict in Ukraine. Russia is already involved in a direct military conflict in Ukraine. So thereby Russia is overstretched. If it wants to resist Finland joining the NATO, it does not have the traditional capacity. So it would have to go to the next level of escalation, which Russia may be calculating that it is not in its interest, right? So both aspects are true, right? Russia is defining what is important for it, what is significant for it, right? Then are we saying that we won't ever think of trying to get POK back? Did I say that, Mohan? I said once we calculate the risk And once we are ready to go beyond that risk, and once we calculate that it is more beneficial to take back POK, any government which thinks that it can do so, and this is the condition, would do that. All right. Ever is a wrong question to ask. Right. There is no ever. All right. Ever कभी होता नहीं है लाइफ में ना. I will never do this. ऐसा अगर आपने कह दिया तो you will end up only following that in violation. Right. You will sometime do it. So ever हम कभी कहते नहीं. हम ये कहते हैं कि ये फैक्टर्स हैं, जब भी हम कैलकुलेट करेंगे हम ये फैक्टर्स कैलकुलेट करेंगे, और जब हम किसी एग्जाम्पल के बारे में एक ओपिनियन रख रहे हैं तो हम हमेशा कोशिश करेंगे कि एक काउंटर करें, एक काउंटर सिनेरियो इमेजिन करें कि भाई ये ठीक है, ये मैं मानता हूं, लेकिन क्या ऐसा भी हो सकता है. सो दैट इज बेसिकली हाउ यू कैलकुलेट थिंग्स, नॉट ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ इमोशंस. है ना, इमोशंस पे बात करना एक तरह से आसान भी है और एक तरह से मुश्किल भी है. राइट. चलिए, let's take a break, and after the break we complete India-Russia relations, because now we have kept aside the distraction, having given it a lot of time. And after the break we will simply focus on India-Russia relations, and towards the end we will talk about India's position on Ukraine. Okay, please come back. Let's start with India-Russia relations. After having seen that there is lot which is being talked about, which may have some significance in the context of this relation, but from the perspective of the examination, only some few basic fundamentals are important. आपकी चिंता तभी होती है जब आप ये सोचने लगे किसी ने मुझसे ये पूछ लिया तो. So you are not the foreign minister, you are not the foreign secretary. If somebody asks you and you don't have the answer, it's nothing to be ashamed of. All right? It's nothing to be ashamed of. Nobody is expecting you fundamentally to know this, but you should be aware of majorly what has happened. That's it. So when we look at this relationship, first of all, we refer to as many of you have said, special and privileged. Strategic partnership, meaning this is a dear friend to us. That's it. This is a special relationship for us. That's it. Right? Nothing more, nothing less. Whether it says special, privilege, or it uses any other superlative, the meaning is that it is an important relationship. The value of these kinds of terms, I will repeat again, is as a jargon to be used in the examination. Any question on Russia, you can start with this line, if you don't have any other line, that India and Russia share a special and privileged strategic partnership. That's it. So in the examination, you have to learn how to use things and where to use things, rather than becoming obsessed with them. So what is the reason? So one, we can say that there is a history. So historic factors make this relationship a special one, historic factors. All right. And then we can say that in the current context also, this relationship is a special one. All right. The current context. In the current context, we have the political and diplomatic engagements, which make this relationship special relationship. Right. Then, why is it stuck? Then we have important areas like defense engagements, which makes this relationship concurrently significant. Then we also have economic engagements with this country, called Russia. And then we have other areas of focus, for example, technology, and let's add with this areas like energy. All right, technology plus energy. And largely what we then can focus on the geostrategic factors in this relationship. Meaning geostrategic factors become important as we are talking about two distant countries. Two distant countries. So how do they look geography as part of their long-term strategy? Right? We can't say that where Russia is located is of immediate primary importance for India. All right? But largely their view of the world has an impact on their relations. So if you look at historic facts, one is the period of USSR. All right? So the existence of USSR had in a way developed as an option for India to pursue its interests. Suppose we were living in a world in which there was no USSR. Right? So the only option that we would have had was US, a US led world. Right? But then that is a hypothetical situation. क्या होता अगर ऐसा होता? ऐसा नहीं था. So the world at that point in time gave us two choices. One, US led Western bloc. Two, USSR led Eastern bloc. What did we choose? We chose non-alignment, to be non-aligned. So our primary interest, focus was, primary choice was not being aligned with any of these two blocks. And what was the specific meaning of it? Not being militarily aligned with any of them. Not being part of either the NATO or NATO-like alliances or the Warsaw Pact. That was basically the merit of non-alignment. We did not want to be part of military blocs. That's it. But nothing prevented us from developing friendly relations with anyone. So India's policy of non-alignment was also about avoiding entanglements, and today also we want to avoid entanglements. Avoiding entanglements and retaining the space for obtaining advantage from both sides. That is what India wanted, right? On the one hand, not getting entangled by joining their military alliances. On the other hand, by remaining in the middle, keeping the option open. Whatever we can get from the west, whatever we can get from the east. Today it would be difficult to understand, but just remember the first few IITs that we built. IIT Kanpur with the help of the Americans. IIT Bombay with the help of the Russians. All right? Or first few industrial units that we built. For example, the steel plants, Durgapur or Bhilai, right? Or Neyveli Lignite Limited. These are some of the examples where we were able to obtain help from both sides. For example, Neyveli Lignite had the assistance of the Russians, the USSR, right? Durgapur, the assistance of steel mill, the assistance of the UK, right? So that is basically what we wanted to choose. But ऐसा होता नहीं है. हमेशा आपकी मर्जी नहीं चलती. आप ये नहीं सोच सकते कि हमेशा जो मैं चाहता हूं, what I want would happen. So eventually, circumstantially, of the two blocks, without becoming an ally, India developed closer relations with USSR. And what were the reasons? Again, the same reasons, political and diplomatic. What? We found that at the UN Security Council, USSR was favorable to India in the sense of the resolutions which came at the UNSC, let's say on the matter of Kashmir. USSR was favorable. It exercised veto favoring India on many such occasions, right? So that is one thing which made clear that maybe out of the two it would be easier to do business with USSR, right? And then what we saw was, one is you have UNSC vetoes where we found that Russia's attitude was much favorable towards India as compared to West. Another is the example of what happened in global politics. So there was a Sino-Soviet rift, and also India-China war. These are the products of the same period, 1960s. As Soviet Union and China started developing differences, India-China differences led to a war-like situation. And this progressively developed in the 1960s. India-China war 1962, China-Russia war, or USSR-Russia war 1969. China was afraid that USSR may use nuclear weapons against it. So then this provides you a larger geostrategic context in which partnership made sense. All right? That A, India and China both shared borders with, or China shared a border with Russia as well as with India. Meaning India and Russia shared both a border with China. Thereby, there are certain fundamental differences which are there. India-China border war and China-Russia border war, 1969. So without going into global politics, even this gives you a sense that when you are feeling threatened by your immediate neighbor, the neighbor of the neighbor becomes a preferred choice, right? If you apply even the Cotilian idea of the mandala theory, all right, that your neighbor is always going to be an immediate threat to you, and the neighbor of your neighbor, meaning the country which shares a border with your neighbor, is going to be friendly with you, or you should at least make it friendly, right? So that practically becomes a reality in this scenario. So Soviet Union is looking at India favorably, and India finds an opportunity in this. Now you see the same period is also when you have the China-US opening up in the same period. China-US opening up is happening in the same period, right? 1971, Henry Kissinger, the then National Security Advisor of the United States, leads diplomacy or diplomatic efforts for US and China to engage with each other. US and PRC, People's Republic of China, to engage with each other. So in the same period you will see 1971, India, USSR signing a treaty of peace, friendship and cooperation. I am not saying that they have anything to do with each other, but the evidence is there right in front of you. You can make your own analysis. 1971, China and USSR engage in what is called ping pong diplomacy, meaning a table tennis team is sent by USA to China, and that is opening up of China with USA. And 1971, India and USSR sign a treaty of peace, friendship and cooperation, right? So treaty of peace, friendship and cooperation then leads to a partnership on a firmer ground between India and USSR. It forms their partnership. So India continues to be non-aligned in its stance, meaning we did not join the military alliance led by USSR, but we certainly developed closer relations with USSR. Why? Because 1962 war had taught us that in order to defend our interests, we would need a stronger global partner. And in that context, USSR seemed to be the easier one to have as a partner. 1971, what else happened? So you would see that 1971, China, US, Pakistan. This is one set of alignment, and the other set of alignment is India, Russia, India, USSR. So US on behalf of Pakistan asked China to open a front. China did not. China adopted more or less, let's say, disinterested stance. Not neutral, but disinterested. It is not our conflict. But USA ultimately sent its aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal, supporting Pakistan, right? And what prevented active intervention of USA was USSR issuing statements like, if US intervenes, we would also intervene, right? So it became a choice by default for us. So Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation meant extensive commitments for economic cooperation. So USSR developed as an important source of development assistance to us, technological assistance to us, plus important defense and strategic engagement, meaning it had a provision that both sides would enter into consultation in the context of any external threat or any act of external aggression. Meaning they did not say that we will fight wars with each other, but we would consult each other when it comes to any external aggression. So this is as far as we can go in terms of developing a closer partnership. So this continued, and after the collapse of USSR, 1991, Russia emerged as the successor state. So what kind of relations did we have with Russia? So 1990s, Russia does not have much of an international presence because it is a very much inward looking country. It is grappling with its own crisis. But we renewed the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1994. All right, Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation is renewed in 1994. Meaning we at least have the intent to continue with these special relations. But now the change is that this is not going to be as exclusive a relationship as it was in Cold War, because what happened during the Cold War period was dictated by the logic of Cold War, the alignments of Cold War. So we have an intent of special relationship, but that context does not exist. USSR US competition or China USSR competition to that extent. So in the changing context, we can say that we decided to remain friends. And then what you see is when the Russians finally re-emerge in the sense of with greater sense of purpose, greater sense of clarity in international relations. So they decided to revive their traditional partnership. How would Russia regain its lost space in international relations? By A, first of all, domestically strengthening itself, but B, by reviving its traditional partnerships. So the year 2000 is when India and Russia start defining their relationship in terms of strategic partnership. Strategic partnership, they start referring their relationship to strategic partnership. And in the same year, what you would see is Vladimir Putin came to India. So one of the features of India-Russia relations is the regular summit. That also starts in 2000. Regular summit. That also starts in the year 2000. So we can say this is this historical background in which we can say that in the Cold War period we developed, according to the logic of that point in time, close defense, strategic and economic relations. And in the post-Cold War period, immediately in the post-Cold War period, when fundamental changes in world politics also brought about changes in India's policy and Russia's policy, in that period also we maintained the commitment of close ties. And in 2000, at the turn of 21st century, we decided to pursue closer relations by defining each other as strategic partners. So this is basically the historic factor that we can, in a sense, simply remember, which is simply referred to these days. For example, Prime Minister Modi giving a speech on India-Russia relations would refer to how Russia is seen as a traditional friendly country in India, right? How a generation growing up remembers Russia to be closest partner. For example, some people would recall that it is quoted in some books that Nikita Khrushchev said that we are your friends and we are not far away, right? If you face any problem, just climb on the peaks of Himalaya and give us a call. We will come. Right? Meaning, kyun? Because Russia, USSR at that point in time was very close to us geographically also. Jammu and Kashmir, Wakhan corridor, Tajikistan. All right? So that's something that Nikita Khrushchev is supposed to have said. Only give us a call. Right? We are only across the Himalayas. Right? So we will come. So that is the memory which we now talk about. And there can be many other debates. People come by reading a lot of things. Well, that is your interest. Now we look at today's relations. So today's relations, of course, we have the arrangements of the past, but today as we see, we define our relationship as special and privileged strategic partnership. Diplomatic political engagements, if you see bilaterally, we have the regular summits. So far India and Russia have held 21 summits. Last one in December 2021, 2 months before Russia launched its Ukraine offensive. So 21st summit took place in December 2021. 21 summits so far. In the same year, we have started with Russia a 2+2 dialogue. So first 2+2 dialogue between India and Russia also took place in 2021. That is where we decided that we will now have 2+2 dialogue. Apart from that, you have traditionally ministerial committees which have been driving this relationship. So these are called India-Russia Intergovernmental Commissions. India-Russia Intergovernmental Commissions. One broadly on military and technology, India-Russia Intergovernmental Commission, and another on economic and cultural issues. Right? India-Russia Intergovernmental Commissions. Another ministerial level bodies which have another set of ministerial level bodies which have existed for a long time for largely driving this relations. So we can see bilaterally we have well developed relations. Sometimes we have had informal summits also. So for example, apart from bilateral summits in Sochi in 2018, Sochi is in Russia, India and Russia held an informal summit, meaning we have made efforts to meet separately to iron out any differences if they have emerged in the relationship. So informal summit 2018, such mechanisms also have been there. And then beyond bilateral, we have meetings, for example, at forums where we are partners with other countries. Russia, India, China trilateral. Russia, India, China trilateral is a brainchild of Russia. It started in 1998. It generally meets at the level of foreign ministers. So RIC is a trilateral foreign ministerial meeting. Russia, India, China trilateral. So these kinds of platforms also exist. And then apart from that, you have interactions at, let's say, groupings like SCO. And it would be easier for you to understand, because when we went to SCO summit this year, what was highlighted was Prime Minister's statement that Your Excellency, today is not the era of war. उसके बाद की लाइन बहुत ज़्यादा लोगों ने बात की नहीं, उसके बाद की लाइनें यही थी. एक तो DDD, dialogue, diplomacy and democracy. And then after that, we have had historically good ties, we have strong ties, we are strategic partners, right? So we meet at SCO also. Russia said what? That we understand India's concerns. All right? So diplomatically, we are cordial, but we are partners also in important institutions like BRICS, right? BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So this reflects one thing, that India and Russia both have a desire to be recognized as important stakeholders in international relations. All right? They want to be recognized as important stakeholders in international relations. Russia to an extent is, because it is a member of, let's say, the UNSC, United Nations Security Council. India wants to become a member, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, but Russia does not like it when it is not part of G7. हमको उतनी इज्जत नहीं मिलती है, या IMF में we are not very important, right? या देखो US की इतनी हिम्मत की NATO को लेके चला आ रहा है हमारी तरफ, right? So that is one desire that they have, seeing a change in international relations, in the international order. Both of them are dissatisfied for their own reasons. But that is one commonality. So that's why they are partnering in creation of new institutions. BRICS is the example of a new institution which focuses on reforms of the international multilateral forums. Right? One goal of BRICS is what? One goal of SCO is what? Both of them, they say that the global order should be democratic. The multilateral system should be reformed. So that is what they say. And each country may have different reasons for arguing that. And then their interaction is also at the level of G20. Right? So they are parts of G20. So Russia may not be a part of G7, but it is part of G20. India is a part of G20. And India next year would be chairing the G20. So these kinds of platforms also give us an opportunity to interact, sometimes build convergence in our positions, right? And then of course there is UNSC, United Nations Security Council, where currently India is serving its tenure as a non-permanent member, and Russia is part of P5, permanent member of the Security Council. So you can say that diplomatically and politically, India's engagement extend from bilateral to regional as well as global. All right, their engagements have multiple layers. Bilateral, of course, the most important one, but also regional, SCO, BRICS, and also global, United Nations Security Council or the G20, right, with some common objectives. So that is where you will find the interactions taking place between India and Russia. Now let's talk about a substantive part of the relationship, which is defense. So what we can say is that India-Russia relations have been largely driven by their defense cooperation. Other areas of engagements are also there, but defense is a traditional area of engagement, traditional area of cooperation. All right, traditionally this is what has driven the relationship, and currently also this is what remains important. So India-Russia defense cooperation is both wide-ranging and long-standing. Now these two words convey a lot of things. What do they convey? When we say that this is a long-standing relationship, so we say that over the last 60 years, Russia has been the largest supplier of defense equipments to India. Right? From the 1960s onwards, Russia has been the largest supplier of defense equipments to India, accounting for more than, in terms of value, more than 60 billion US dollars. Right? So more than 60 billion US dollars worth of defense equipments have come from India. And if you look at currently also, that is the same status. Top 3. If you look at the portfolio of defense acquisition from Russia as well as support for repair and refurbishment, Russia would be the largest. All right, if you let's say take the period of 2016 to 2020 and different projects, either something that we are negotiating to buy or something that we have already signed to buy, or the repair support that we get from Russia, the spare parts, etc. So it would be the largest defense partner. In terms of defense acquisition, year to year, the portfolio may change. For example, recently we have started buying more and more from US also. So even in that context, it would always remain in top 3. But we can safely say that it is the largest defense supplier to India in the historic term, right? And when we say wide ranging, it means a lot of things. So for example, we talked about defense equipments being exchanged between the two sides, traded between the two sides. So we have examples of licensed production, meaning such equipments which were developed by Russia, manufactured in India. So you have various examples. For example, the T-90 battle tanks, T-90 battle tanks, on which the Arjun tanks are based, is a Russian product which we have been manufacturing. Su-30, Sukhoi 30, we bought from Russia, but we also manufacture it in India at HAL under the licensed agreement from or with Russia. All right, T-90 tanks. We have examples of joint production also. What joint production do we have? So we have the most important example of the BrahMos missile systems, right? So some products we have jointly developed, research and development, production, and as well as now the marketing of it. So the BrahMos system. And then we have larger examples of acquisition, defense acquisition, meaning what we have bought from Russia, right? So we have bought a lot of things from Russia, but what is these days talk about is S-400 air defense systems. All right, a lot of people are interested in the names of these things, but these are only examples of different kinds. Either we have acquired defense products from Russia and we are manufacturing them as part of licensed production, or we have developed certain things jointly with Russia, but very few examples, for example, BrahMos, or we have acquired, even in the recent times, even in the face of difficulty, important pieces of technology from Russia, for example, the S-400, which is widely said to be the best in its class, right? So various examples. Now, when we move beyond this, what we find is that we, in the era of Make in India, would like Russia to be a partner helping in defense indigenization. So there is a basic contradiction in India-Russia relations also. Russia is among the largest exporters of defense products, right? So thereby India is important for Russia because India has been an important market. But now India wants to indigenize. So then how would we translate this in the future of the relationship? Meaning, if India gets technology from Russia, then Russia's value as a supplier would dwindle. So there is a basic contradiction also, right? So then this is the new era of partnership that we have to think about. But we are thinking about it, for example, joint production in the context of AK-203 rifles being manufactured in India. AK-47, theek hai, you prefer it. But AK-203 rifles, we have established Indo-Russian Rifles Limited, right? Remember, India has announced various initiatives for defense manufacturing, for example, defense corridor, one in Uttar Pradesh, another in Tamil Nadu. So AK-203 manufacturing facility has been established at Korwa in Uttar Pradesh, right? So that is another example of joint production. Now we may think that this is the future. Joint production, meaning Russia and India establishing joint ventures to produce defense products in India. But we may also like more BrahMos-like projects. For example, there was a 5th generation fighter aircraft project which has not moved forward, right? So that's the future that we can think of, joint production. So all these examples are there. And then you have examples, for example, India wants to acquire nuclear powered and nuclear capable submarines. Technically very difficult to acquire. US would not give it to us. So we hope that we can acquire this from Russia. All right, the Akula class submarine, as it is called, the nuclear capable submarines. So that is another piece of strategic technology that we don't have, and we hope to acquire it from Russia. And if you see, our defense platforms like the aircraft carriers that we have had in the past have been based on the Russian platform of the past. So there is much that we can gain from Russia, or at least we hope that we can gain from Russia. There is much dependence on Russia also in terms of most of defense platforms across our armed forces are based on Russian supplies, specifically in the Air Force and in the Navy. We have a large dependence on Russia or Russian origin supplies. So apart from this engagement in defense equipments in different forms, we also have other ways of engaging with each other. So we have joint exercises. Series of joint exercises conducted by India and Russia. For example, the Air Force exercise is called Avia Indra. The naval exercise is called Indra Navy, and the military exercise simply goes by the Indra series. All right, the name Indra. So name Indra is associated with military exercises between India and Russia that are part of this particular relation. Adishwar says Amethi, of course. Korwa is in Amethi, right? If you wanted to mention it, well, great. So joint exercises, and then we also have started tri-services exercise. Tri-services exercise has also been started between India and Russia, and that also is spelled simply as Indra. Indra series of exercise. Capital I, capital N, capital D, capital R, capital A, right? Tri-services exercise. So that is something that also we have started. So we have extensive cooperation in the area of defense. Long-standing and wide-ranging. That's the key word. Historic cooperation plus wide variety of examples. When it comes to defense acquisition, license production, joint manufacturing, and large defense acquisition, meaning simple buyer and seller relationship. When it comes to the future, we are thinking of partnering with Russia in terms of defense indigenization under Make in India. Example, ventures like AK-203, Indo-Russian Rifles Limited, that we have created as a joint venture. And when we look at engagement between the armed forces, there are many meetings, conferences, etc. But there are regular exercises under the Indra series. Avia Indra or Indra Navy or simply the Indra Army exercise, and now we call our tri-services exercise also as the Indra series of exercise. So that is how we see defense relations with this country. Now let's move forward and let's look at the aspect of economic linkages. So when we see economic linkages, we can say that this remains a priority. So different joint statements between India and Russia have identified economic engagements as the priority area. Right? Defense is there, but any relationship which is based on only a single factor cannot be sustained for long. So we want to diversify our relations, and an obvious area of focus is economic engagements, expansion of trade. So if you look at it, these countries have a target of reaching, for example, a trade of 30 billion US dollars. 30 billion US dollars is the target between these two sides. So that shows that this is a priority. Every document would identify it. But here we see that the weakness of relation starts emerging. If we don't account for the defense trade, and generally defense trade and normal trade are not accounted for together. So the trade relations between India and Russia have been considerably weak. They don't easily reflect the title of the relationship, that is a special privileged strategic partnership, right? So 30 billion target. Generally trade has remained below 10 billion. Generally trade has remained below 10 billion, right? Slightly close to 10 billion, 7 billion, 11 billion, but generally this has been the trade. So trade has been lagging. It has focused on some areas, for example, petrochemicals, fertilizers. They constitute for bulk of the trade, meaning trade basket is very narrow, right? Fertilizers and other raw materials. So trade basket is very narrow. So that's one weakness that you will see in this relationship. However, if we see the current context, we may see some improvement. 2021, the trade was around 13 billion, slightly more than 13 billion US dollars. It has moved to 13 billion US dollars in 2021. If we look at the first first half of 2022, the trade has already crossed 11 billion US dollars, right? In the first half of 2022, the trade has already crossed 11 billion US dollars. But we also understand then that even this is based on a very narrow basket of traded commodities or traded goods. So it may not be a long-term sustainable pattern, right? So currently, even if the trade has increased, it is not on the basis of any fundamental factors. So thereby, the two sides, while prioritizing trade with a target of 30 billion US dollars, have also started making efforts to enhance trade. One is the India-Russia Strategic Economic Dialogue, which started in the year 2018. India-Russia Strategic Economic Dialogue, to understand trade relations better, economic difficulties better, and to act on them. It happens at the level of think tanks, economic think tanks, Niti Aayog of India, with the planning body of Russia. So India-Russia Strategic Economic Dialogue has been started. These countries then also focused on creating certain customs arrangements which may be helpful in improving trade. So one was creation of working on a green corridor, specifically in areas like agricultural commodities. So it has been proposed that India and Russia work on a green corridor, which is a customs corridor, meaning once you have this agreement, goods passing from India to Russia would not have to go through extensive customs check. So that it is understood would reduce time required for trade. It would reduce the time and thereby the cost of trade, establishment of green corridor in areas like agricultural commodities. And then we also have discussed in various meetings, this has been a long-standing part of discussion, payments in local currencies, which we now know as rupee-ruble trade. Rupee-ruble trade had existed between USSR and India. That's why it was one of the important trading partners. So we, in the current context, had been discussing a way of improving trade in the form of the payments in local currencies or rupee-ruble trade as a way of improving trade relations. And then we also realize that one of the reasons why the trade is low is the distance itself. The distance that it takes for exporting from India to Russia and from exporting from Russia to India. So they have been thinking about working on connectivity measures. So one of the most important ones which have been talked about over and over again is INSTC, International North-South Trade Transport Corridor, which these countries have been saying that this would improve our trade further, INSTC. And then others also in recent times. For example, Chennai-Vladivostok corridor, right? And then another idea is that India and Russia trade would benefit by some sort of free trade agreement. So one free trade agreement that India has been interested in, the context of India-Russia trade relations is a trade agreement with Eurasian Economic Union. All right, Eurasian Economic Union. Eurasian Economic Union has been in existence since 2014, and it includes countries like Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, right? So India is interested in a free trade agreement with these countries, and this since it includes Russia, it is expected that it would improve India-Russia trade. Not directly a free trade agreement with Russia, but certainly free trade agreement with entities involving Russia has been on the cards. We have been negotiating it. And then there are further steps which are important in the context of economic engagements. What steps are important? So if we see, apart from trade as economic engagements, we can also talk about investments relations. So India and Russia had a target of reaching investments of 30 billion earlier. Earlier, they had a target of reaching to 30 billion US dollars of investments bilaterally. 15 billion US dollars from India to Russia and 15 billion US dollars from Russia to India. That was the target for 2025. Now it has been revised to 50 billion US dollars, 50 billion US dollars. And this then is a result of investments already crossing by 2017. The investments had crossed 31 billion US dollars. 13 billion US dollars of investments by India. 13 billion US dollars of investments by India in Russia. And 18 billion US dollars of investments, and this number has been increasing, 18 billion US dollars of investments by Russia in India. So now, by encouraged by achieving the target quite early, they have expanded the target to 50 billion US dollars. By 2025, they aim to invest 25 billion dollars each in each other's economy, right? So that's basically another way in which we see this being an important part of the relations. And generally, what we see is India's investments are in the energy sector of Russia. All right, where one example, old example, is Sakhalin. Right, ONGC Limited had bought stakes in the Sakhalin oil field, gas fields of Russia. So mainly our investments are in the energy sectors of Russia. Tata Group is there, GAIL is there, ONGC is there, and this also tells us something interesting, that if you see why Russia from the energy perspective is important, because Russia so far is responsible for 25% of global gas production and 20% of global oil production. So one of the countries outside of OPEC, which is the major block of oil and gas producers, oil producers mainly, is Russia, right? 20% of global oil production comes from Russia. 25% of global gas production comes from Russia. So in the energy sector globally, it may not be much noticed many a times, because other countries are talked about a lot, but Russia is an important player, right? And Indian companies have been investing in Russia from this perspective. So that is where our investments are located. And then we can move forward and link the same with what is happening and what is relevant currently, right? So we said that we can talk about technology and energy. So that let's take this together, technology and energy, in continuation with what we have talked about right now. So let's take the example of energy. So what you see is India's energy imports from Russia, 1% of petroleum imports, and generally data in this area is never going to be very clear. But we say that traditionally in recent years, our imports from Russia were around 1% of our energy needs. Now in 2022, it has increased. For example, if you look at September we imported around 800,000 barrels of oil from Russia. 800,000 barrels of oil. If you look at the month of June, 900,000 barrels of oil from Russia. And in that context, if you look at only in this short period, Russia became the largest supplier of oil to India. Very short period, right? Why? Because the opportunities. Rising imports of petroleum. But we had already started importing petroleum from Russia, LNG from Russia in 2018-19. Right? We had started importing from US also in the same year. Right? So that is something that gives you a picture of how Russia has been an important part of India's energy security planning. We were not thinking that Ukraine war would happen. We have been planning from a long-term perspective. Right? And long-term perspective is diversify your sources of energy imports. Don't rely on any single source. Now that's why there is a spanner in our planning. If Russia keeps on getting involved in these kinds of disputes, it would be very difficult for India. But so far, this has been the case, right? So in the context of increasing difficulties for Russia, India emerged as an important partner in terms of continuing to buying oil from it. And we are not doing it because Russia is the best friend. We are simply doing it because we said that India is a large country. India as a large country also has significant absolute poverty. And for that, in that context, our energy security is important. So unless some country ensures us cheaper oil supplies, we will buy from Russia because it is part of our own calculated national interest. That's what we are saying. अगर कहीं से सस्ता ऑयल मिल रहा है तो दे दो, फ्री में मिल रहा है तो वो भी दे दो. If you want us to side with you in sanctions on Russia, so please ensure that we get a cheap oil. If you are not doing that, then we will buy oil from Russia. So that is what we have done. One difficulty simply was, how do we transport it? So transportation always is a challenge from Russia. Second is, how do we pay for it? Now the difficulty is, how do we pay for it? So that's why we have been working on the rupee-ruble trade mechanism. And generally see rupee-ruble trade right now in India, Russia engagements is available for energy imports. And so what has happened? So that has simply happened in the context of an Indian bank holding for its Russian partner. Right? So Indian bank, Russian bank holding what are called Vostro account. Meaning when you are holding an account on behalf of another entity or another corresponding bank. So rupee-ruble trade would be promoted by this kind of a mechanism where an Indian bank would hold a rupee account on behalf of a Russian counterpart bank, correspondent bank, and a Russian bank would hold a ruble account on part of its Indian counterpart, Indian correspondent bank, right? So whatever we are doing would be paid in local currencies. Russian exports to India would be paid by the Indian account which is there, so we will be paying in rupee, right? And that would be submitted to the Vostro account, that would be debited from the Vostro account of that Russian entity, and simultaneously what we buy from Russia or what we buy from Russia would be paid in ruble, and that would happen in the Vostro account of the correspondent bank there in Russia. So in that sense, what is happening? We are moving away from dollar payments. The only difficulty is, how would we decide the exchange rates? All right, how would we decide the exchange rates? And ironically, the ruble has strengthened in recent times. रूबल का प्राइस नीचे नहीं गया, रूबल का प्राइस ऊपर की तरफ जा रहा है, right? That is strange. So that is one difficulty that we would have. But we have decided on, in principle, RBI has given approval for rupee ruble trade as it existed earlier, and it would happen, it would take place on the basis of the Vostro account that would be opened, right? So we are taking so much of effort. Why? Simple single reason that there is a window of opportunity for buying cheaper Russian oil while oil prices globally has gone up. Secondly, what will we do of those investments that we made in Russia? All right, and majorly our investments were in the energy sector in Russia. So that's basically our problem, that we have this relationship. Now we have to do something about it. And then in terms of bringing energy resources from Russia, India had proposed the Chennai-Vladivostok route, energy corridor. Chennai-Vladivostok energy corridor was proposed by India and Russia. Let's see whether we work on it or not. But this is a new connectivity route which we had talked about in the context of simply energy trade. Now, not only this, India and Russia have a commitment of, or had a commitment of, developing what they called an energy bridge. It simply means, it does not have any basis right now. Okay, energy bridge, it simply means that India and Russia would be working on hydrocarbons, they would be working on nuclear energy, they would be working on renewables, meaning they would diversify their energy relations. So that was another aim in this relationship, creation of an energy bridge, meaning extensive energy cooperation. Now let's add technology to it. So two areas of technology have been very important in India's relations with Russia. One is space technology. So if you go back in history, India's first satellite was launched on a Soviet rocket, all right? And India's first cosmonaut or astronaut, Mr. Rakesh Sharma, went to space on Russia's Soyuz capsule. So that is a historical example that we have, that we had space technology cooperation. Right now the areas of interest that we had was cooperation in Gaganyaan, meaning India's first manned space mission which India had planned. So right now only one country, friendly country with a significant capability in this regard is Russia, because of its operations of the International Space Station. It still operates the International Space Station, right? And it is conducting manned space flights. China also has made a movement in this direction, but it is not a friendly country. So Gaganyaan. Second is India's own. If you see, the news recently has been the government saying that the mobile manufacturers should start using the Navik system. So we have our separate systems, right? So India's Navik may benefit from greater geographic reach towards Russia. Russia has a vast geography, so it would help us in expanding the reach of Navik. And Russia's own navigation system, GLONASS, would benefit from accessing India's capabilities in terms of coverage in the Indian Ocean region, South Asia region, right? So by cooperating, we may be able to make our navigation systems more effective rather than having to rely on the current and currently popular GPS system, which is a US based system, right? So GLONASS and Navik based cooperation has been in pipeline, that we have been talking about this kind of cooperation. And then we have another area in technology which is relevant in the context of energy also. Civil nuclear cooperation. So India and Russia signed a civil nuclear agreement in 2009, and that has been operationalized pretty easily. So we see the operation of the Kudnakulam nuclear power plant. Kudnakulam nuclear power plant is operational. We signed civil nuclear agreement with US in 2008. Not operational in terms of any US company operating or not operating, but US company involved in nuclear power projects in India. We have signed a civil nuclear agreement with France. France is establishing a nuclear power plant at Jaitapur. France is a partner in nuclear power plant at Jaitapur. But with Russia, we signed it. We immediately started working on it. And right now, units 1, 2, 3 of Kudnakulam nuclear power plant are operational. All right. And we are still further working on units 3, 4, and 5. So basically, this is an operational example of nuclear cooperation. And we have signed in 2019 a future work plan for operationalization of civil nuclear cooperation, meaning we want to expand it even further. 2019 action plan that we signed for expansion of civil nuclear cooperation. So this is another example of, आप दोनों को कोई प्रॉब्लम है अभी? You went running there and I see that you are talking. So कोई प्रॉब्लम है तो you can say temperature. Okay. I thought temperature is the problem because I am feeling a bit warm or hot today. ऐसा है क्या? Okay. मुझे भी गर्मी लग रही थी, मुझे लगा मुझे गर्मी क्यों लग रही है अचानक से? हाँ? Due to Russia? Okay. Now, so basically Kudnakulam nuclear power plant is an example of both technological cooperation and energy cooperation. When we say that we will be building an energy bridge, we simply say that we will be cooperating in hydrocarbons. So that's the most important area of cooperation. We have understood it in terms of increasing supplies, but also in investments of India in the hydrocarbon sector. Similarly, when we say we will build an energy bridge, it also means moving towards nuclear energy cooperation. So we already have the example of Kudnakulam power plant. And we also have said that we will be working on renewables. Russia is not very interested in renewables. Russia would be the happiest country when global warming, climate change takes place. All right, why? Because its large permafrost region would become accessible, meaning where its energy resources are locked. So Russia is very happy. Russia is one of the countries which would support climate change to take place because its geography then becomes much more meaningful. Right now, very small area where habitation is possible. Its far east is inaccessible, where its energy resources are locked, right? And thereby, some of the things which would be helpful, combining technology cooperation, energy cooperation, as well as investments, is remembering that India and Russia are cooperating in terms of development of Russia's Far East Forum. So Russia had held a Far East Forum. It holds Far East Forum regularly, in which the aim is to invite partnership for the development of the Far East region of Russia, right? So India's Prime Minister was a chief guest at the Far East Forum in 2019, and when we were the chief guest, we also announced that we will be giving $1 billion of line of credit for the development of Far East of Russia. $1 billion. $1 billion for development of Far East region of Russia, right? So that is another cooperation. How is it significant? So if you can broadly relate it to the fact that our investments are in the energy sector. Energy sector of Russia is in the eastern part of Russia. So economic developments, investment commitment in this context is also relevant strategically, right? Because we want to expand our reach in the far east of Russia. Now, similarly, geostrategically also, but from the sense of, from the perspective of the future of energy. India and Russia have been discussing cooperation in Arctic exploration. India is not an Arctic country, but Arctic is important from multiple perspectives for the future of the globe. Right? Traditional perspective is large untapped reserves of hydrocarbon. Right? Secondly, the climate change which is happening, global warming which is happening, is most visible. अगर किसी को शक हो कि ऐसा हो रहा है, so you can go and find the evidence in the Arctic, because the Arctic ice shelf is melting fast, and thereby we think that not far away, but by 2030 there would be a new trade route, right? Which is the new northern route, as people are saying, a new route between the Pacific and the Atlantic, right? So in that context, the global engagements may change in orientation. 2030 तक हो सकता है हम इंडो पैसिफिक नहीं, इंडो पैसिफिक अटलांटिक की बात कर रहे हो, right? Because Arctic would provide that passageway. And then Arctic is also important for us because if we want to understand complex relation between what happens at the poles, its effect on the global wind pattern, and then its effect on winters in India, or generally the weather in India, monsoons in India, then understanding the Arctic is important, right? Arctic research. So from the perspective of science and technology, from the perspective of in the future, new trade route opening, new northern route opening in the Arctic, or from the perspective of simply keeping an eye on remaining sources of energy, hydrocarbons, if Arctic opens up. We need a partner, and Russia is a partner with whom we have been talking about cooperation in Arctic exploration. Alright, so that's why you will see India is also in the process of developing its own. First of all, the Antarctic bill is there. Second of all, we are thinking of the Arctic policy. Alright, Arctic policy draft paper is there. It has been circulated. So we are thinking of the future, and when we are thinking of the future, geography of Russia becomes important. The Arctic. So these are different aspects of cooperation with Russia which should come to our mind before we start discussing the larger points of geostrategy. The larger points of geostrategy. For example, let's say, if anyone is interested in this detail, India and Russia have also been talking about a gas pipeline. Alright, the possibility of a gas pipeline. Far-fetched reality because geography does not allow for it. But Russia and China already have a gas pipeline which has been built. So we may think of a future, in which there would be a pipeline between Russia, China and India. अगर हम imagine करना चाहें तो. But these are futuristic ideas. But what we have discussed are some of the most effective examples of different aspects of India-Russia relations. So thereby we reach to the analytical part, the last part of this relationship, after having developed a familiarity with the different aspects of why this relationship is important. So if we talk about the geostrategic factors, we see that we start talking about very broad ideas beyond the specific. So geostrategic factors would mean that India and Russia may be two far-flung geographies, far-away geographies, separated geographies, but then they can be useful to each other. So let's bring in geostrategy, meaning long-term significance of geography in their thinking. One, the most common thing that you must have noticed is a discussion which has suddenly sprung up on Eurasia. Suddenly, पिछले एक साल में, there are a lot of articles on Eurasia, which was not the case 2 years back. We used to talk about Eurasia, but once in a while. But now if you see, for example, C. Rajamohan writing in the Indian Express, it seems that every other week he is talking about Eurasia, or what would happen in Eurasia, etc., etc. So that is simply a realization that Russia straddles across a vast landmass. And there is no geographical barrier between what is Asia and what is Europe. That's a simple idea. That what is Asia and what is Europe. There is no significant geographical difference between the two. Right? So then this is a region of transition. Transition of cultures, transition of spheres of influence. And this region may also be important in the context of future of global connectivity. If China is building, let's say, BRI, where is it passing through? China connecting to Europe. It is passing through what is called Eurasia. Right? If Russia, Europe, Ukraine war is taking place, where is it taking place right now? It is taking place in Eurasia. So for different reasons, Eurasia has become important. And many scholars are now saying that India needs to develop, कम से कम आर्टिकल का हेडलाइन आपको याद होगा, India needs to develop a coherent Eurasian strategy, keeping in mind that this is one landmass where its interests are there, be it Central Asian countries, be it in relation to China's BRI, be it a shorter route to Europe, be it relations with Russia. Eurasia is the next theater which is geostrategically significant. So in the Eurasia theater, in India's calculation, Russia is a factor of strength as well as weakness. All right. So if we calculate it from the perspective of traditional ties, Russia is the largest Eurasian country, right? And Russia is nothing but Eurasia. So Russia can be an ideal partner in expanding India's footprint in Eurasia, right? If we look at it from the traditional prism, that we have had friendly relations, and location of India may be important for India developing its relations in a region which is largely ignored in India's foreign policy. But if we look at it from the perspective of current events, we find that relations with Russia may also be a weakness, because now Russia's neighbors have developed a distrust towards Russia. For example, what Russia did in Ukraine is causing an alarm in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan वाले सोच रहे हैं कि रशिया के साथ कैसा रिलेशन होना चाहिए, और फ्यूचर में what prevents Russia from saying that Kazakhstan is also our part of strategic influence and we annex Kazakhstan. तुम तो हमसे ही निकल के आए हो, यूएसएसआर के सब पार्ट थे, तो वापस में एक हो जाते हैं. So what Russia is doing is also raising a lot of questions. Russia may be becoming a reason for a part of regional instability in the context of its involvement in Georgia, in the context of its involvement in Ukraine, in the context of the recent developments in Kazakhstan. All right. But also, if you see, there is something which is happening in Azerbaijan and Armenia. क्या हो रहा है Azerbaijan और Armenia में? Azerbaijan and Armenia also came out of USSR. So they have certain territorial disputes dating back from the period of USSR. Azerbaijan के बीच में there is an area called Nagorno-Karabakh. बहुत सारे लोगों ने बात की होगी. अब Nagorno-Karabakh के साथ प्रॉब्लम ये है that it is in Azerbaijan, but it is of Armenian majority. लोग कौन है? Armenian. but land किसके पास है? Azerbaijan के पास. So this is an unnatural situation in which there may be always a possibility of conflict. So there have been multiple series of conflicts between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The latest one broke out recently. So far, Russia had brokered peace and had ensured a ceasefire. So what Russia is doing, if Russia becomes weak, let's say by being overstretched, जैसे किसी ने कहा Finland. So suppose Russia is already overstretched in Ukraine, now it decides to overstretch itself in Finland or any other crisis. Then what would happen? Then what would happen is that in Eurasia, a counter power point to Russia may emerge. And people are saying that Azerbaijan, if it is today emboldened, it is today emboldened by the weakness of Russia. And then there is Azerbaijan and Turkey, right? So Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. If you see, these geographies are connected. Pakistan, Iran, Azerbaijan, Turkey. Now just start imagining geography. So then this second orientation or geostrategic orientation may develop in this region if Russia continues on this path. So in simple terms, what we can say is that relations with Russia are significant for India's Eurasian interests if we start imagining our interest in such a vast expanse. है ना, कभी तो सोचेंगे पाकिस्तान के बियॉन्ड, चाइना के बियॉन्ड, दुनिया बहुत बड़ी है. So if we look at Eurasia, Russia's relations are important, relations with Russia are important in the context of Eurasia, right, in both senses. As the largest Eurasian country, Russia may be helpful in expanding or defending India's interest in larger Eurasia, interest in energy, interest in connectivity, or larger geostrategic interests, right? On the one hand, ye hoga. On the other hand, the current predicaments of Russia are creating instability in Eurasia. All right, the current predicaments of Russia are creating instability in Eurasia, which in any case is going to be a vital region for India. So that's something that we will keep in mind. That one geography that we think of when it comes to Russia is Eurasia. Second geography that we think of when it comes to Russia is the Arctic. And there is a simple understanding that when it comes to the long-term geostrategic future of India's interests, Arctic is vital. And Russia as a country of the Arctic is going to be important for India from the perspective of Arctic exploration or defending its interest in the Arctic. So it's a partner in the Arctic. But then in the Arctic, what we see is there is also equally possible proposition of a closer Russia-China partnership, because China now has a declared Arctic policy. China has invented a new category. It says that we are a near Arctic country. So the US says that there is nothing near Arctic. Either you are an Arctic country or you are a non-Arctic country. China is saying that we are a near Arctic country, meaning China continuously keeps on searching for justification of expanding its interest. So its future plan is to develop infrastructure across the Arctic coast, all right, which it calls the New Polar Silk Road. So one is India's own interest from energy perspective, from environmental perspective, and there Russia can be a partner, but Russia would only be a partner when it has the bandwidth left for being a partner with India. So you also have the idea of New Polar Silk Road that China is building in the Arctic, and that relies on locations on Russia's Arctic coast, investment in Russia's Arctic coast, ports, right? And also if it wants to invest in European Arctic coast. So then what we see is in the Arctic there is potential, but also there is chances of divergence insofar as China's own ambition of becoming an Arctic power is concerned. So we are in India, so we start imagining India as much powerful as compared to what it is. Reality check zaruri hai. China has much advanced interest in Arctic, and China-Russia partnership also is a reality that may happen. So that is the second geography. Third geography within Eurasia that we think of is Central Asia. All right, and we will after Russia talk about Central Asia. So we can think that in Central Asia, India's significant weakness is lack of geographical connect. We don't have geographical connect with Central Asia. And again, if we see, if we are interested in Central Asian markets, if we are interested in Central Asian energy, if we are interested in the location of Central Asia as a transit point for our connectivity projects, ये हमारा goal है. But we are not alone. China has its own BRI. China shares a border with Central Asian countries, which we don't have. All right. So in that context, we always think and calculate that Russia, another friendly country in Central Asia can be Russia. Right. So our Central Asian policy to a certain extent also relies on the role of Russia as a factor of stability in this region. How? we believe in the long term that Russia would not like the domination of Central Asia by China. Some people argue that Russia supported India's inclusion in SCO as a counterbalance to China, that SCO does not become dominated by China. So that was part of Russia's calculation, from which we also may benefit, right, in Central Asia. But as when we are talking about the Eurasian region itself, we understand that it may be an overestimate if we think that Central Asia would always welcome Russia as a stabilizing factor. If Russia goes to an extreme, the possibility is there. If Russia goes to an extreme of defining its sphere of influence, then Central Asian countries would calculate and think that it is beneficial to cooperate with China, right? So Russia's policy may create instability in Central Asia. So on the one hand, we think that Russia can be beneficial for us in Central Asia. On the other hand, there is always a possibility that Russia may be a factor of instability. This is what everybody is talking about. And then let's go from here to the larger Indo-Pacific. And here we find, अभी तक तो हम speculate कर रहे थे what would happen in the Arctic, what may happen in the Central Asian region, what may happen in the Eurasian region, and we simply are saying the same things. Either it can be a partner in the positive sense or it can be part of the problem. तो तभी हमारा यूरेशियन डिलेमा है, करें तो करें क्या, राइट? जाए तो जाए कहां? So Indo-Pacific tells us that the possibility of divergence between India and Russia is real. Why? Because of their distinctly different orientation. So here if we see, Russia believes or Russia says that Indo-Pacific is a US sponsored terminology or category, meaning Russia is not in favor of using the term Indo-Pacific. Or in other simple words, Russia views Indo-Pacific from the prism of its contentions with the USA. All right? So in that context, Russia has more commonality with China, India has more commonality with USA. So there is a clear difference when it comes to the future of Indo-Pacific. And we can look at this equation in this context, right? So India and Russia are friendly countries otherwise, but if we are thinking of our future in the Indo-Pacific, and why did we prefer Indo-Pacific in the larger strategic sense? अगर हम principles की बात को एक बार किनारे रख दें, if we keep principles aside, Indo-Pacific provides us an opportunity to expand the geostrategic arena to balance China, right? When we start talking about Indo-Pacific, we start finding more points at which we can balance China, more points where we can receive cooperation against China. So we are expanding our geostrategic space of maneuvering, right? हो सकता है मैं LAC पे कमजोर हूं, पर हो सकता है हम इंडियन ओशन में मजबूत हो. China is also playing its Indian Ocean game. So then we need to take the game to the Pacific Ocean. All right. So we are expanding our strategic space in that sense. So if that is our future, then partnership with Russia may not be as useful there. If you strictly think in terms of the military, security, defense element of Indo-Pacific. And differences would persist, right? And the convergence between China and Russia becomes much more clear in the Indo-Pacific. Both of them have a common anti-Western view. So that's another challenge that we have. Differences in the Pacific, in the way we look at the larger concerns. And then we can talk about, let's say, the Indian Ocean. So why would Russia be interested in India? Because India can provide Russia a greater opening in Asia, greater exposure in Asia, in the Indian Ocean region. If Russia starts thinking its future in that sense, as it thought about in the 19th century. So in 19th century we talked about the Great Game. Russians wanted to expand southwards. Kyun? What was the reason? Why did they capture Central Asia? Why were they interested in Iran? And why were the Britishers afraid that Russians would be interested in India? One primary reason, Russia does not have a warm water port. So access to Indian Ocean is in the long-term strategic interest of Russia. And India is an Indian Ocean country. India is an Indian Ocean country. Alright. So that means that there is a possibility in which we can think of India being the dominant partner or India being the more important partner in the geostrategic engagements between Russia and India. In the Indian Ocean, Russia would need India more than India needs Russia. अगर हम कहीं पे मजबूत हैं तो कहाँ पे मजबूत हैं? In the Indian Ocean region. So that may also be a logic of building a geostrategic convergence, not a very easy thing. For example, one thing that we can see, Russian fishing fleets are active in the Indian Ocean region. Russian fishing fleets are active in the Indian Ocean region. So then we can think that if Russia's interest in the Indian Ocean develops to any logical extent, this would be another geostrategic arena for enhancing our cooperation, right? Not maybe in the Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean region. So thereby you will remember a few things. What will you remember? You will remember that when India talks about Indo-Pacific, it uses a term, inclusive. Meaning there may be divergence, but there is also points of convergence or India's efforts to bring in Russia in the Indo-Pacific arena. Right? So India says that Russia is also a Pacific country and Indo-Pacific should be inclusive. Right? So we should not be forgetting about these kinds of ideas that are there. Right? And we must not forget a few things. That if there is a geostrategic difference in orientation, if it is visible, it is not directed against each other, right? So if we start reading, so some people favor reality. So in reality, some people would say that it's clear that Russia is moving towards China. Russia in recent times has also opened up to Pakistan, which was not the case. So our relationship is not as exclusive as it used to be. Russia is cheating. All right, cheating in the sense in the relationship. But that is not the case. It is not directed against each other. Russia's friendship with China is not directed against India. India's friendship with USA is not directed against Russia. Right? So that's what we can say, that geostrategic difference in orientation is not directed against each other. That's clear, meaning there is no reason to believe that we would be direct enemies. So it's all about collateral damage of the relationship. How much damage is acceptable to us to pursue relations with Russia? So far as we will weigh that benefits, or we consider that benefits outweigh the risks, we would see India-Russia relations developing. We would make effort to develop India-Russia relations. So right now we can say that it is not directed against each other. The geostrategic fault lines and resultant polarization is leading to difficult choices. Right? So even though we may not be directed against each other, but still what is happening? What do we see in global politics today? There is clearly emergence of new geopolitical or old geopolitical fault lines. The USSR West, Russia West fault line was there in the Cold War period. Now we see it has re-emerged. Right? So that's very clear. Secondly, a general east-west competition or east-west contention was part of Cold War. It has emerged right now. Polarization is happening. On the one hand, US-led Western pole. On the other hand, Russia and China led Eastern pole. Right? So this polarization is happening. That's a reality. And what is it doing? It is leading to difficult choices. Now, our people are saying, some people would say that India is in the sweet spot. Meaning, now, if you have to say, talk about it favorably, you will say, West is also seeking us. East is also seeking us. Right? That we are in a geostrategic sweet spot. But I would say that geostrategic sweet spot has been there for the last 20 years. And now we are seeing that that geostrategic sweet spot is eroding. Why? The more the polarization, the greater the demands on India to take sides. All right? Or to choose. And it would lead to a very complex sets of choices. है ना? अभी तक सिंपल चॉइस कर सकते थे, मल्टी अलाइनमेंट, सबके साथ दोस्ती. अब सबके साथ दोस्ती पे एक क्वेश्चन होगा that neither this friend would trust you completely nor that friend would trust you completely. Can you see that? Yes, you can see that. All right? You can see that. Russia, China declared a partnership without limit in the month of February. And generally their positions are closing in. And there is an economic logic to it. Russia and China had signed in 2014 a $400 billion worth of gas deal. So Russia अपने पैर पे कुल्हाड़ी मार रहा है, हमारा दोस्त, and it is becoming economically weaker. The more economically weak it becomes, the more dependent it would become on China. All right. So even though Russia would not like to be a junior partner, its actions for the time being are relegating it in that direction. So it's very, very clear. Then there would be doubts in our mind, and nothing destroys us more than doubt in crucial moments. Exam के hall में जाओगे doubt. मुझे आंसर पता है लेकिन हिम्मत नहीं आ रही है. So doubt. Now we have doubt. Can we trust Russia in the long term? Can we rely on Russia? अभी तक बहुत simply चल रहा था. Defense supplier Russia एक reliable है. So now we have to think. Now look at US. We gave very frank message to US, है ना? We gave very frank message to US. खुल के बात कर रहे हैं. तो US ने भी हमको इशारा दे दिया. F-16 assistance to Pakistan. And US ने भी हमको वही language में बोल दिया कि we don't equate relation between Pakistan and India. These are two independent relations based on our own merit. So जो हम बोलते हैं वो जवाब हमको वैसे ही मिल सकता है. Right? So rather than celebrating things or being dejected by things, it has to be understood. ये स्टैमिना का गेम है. Just as MS Dhoni used to say, the team which loses is the one which loses hope first. All right? So you would always have to. ऐसा कभी नहीं होगा कि ये गेम खत्म हो जाएगा या हम जीत गए. This is the moment of our victory. No. It would be either a space in which we have easier choices available or a space in which we have very difficult choices available. Ultimately, it is about choices. So then this is a difficult choice. अगर हम सबको भाषण देते रहेंगे, principles, रशिया के साथ क्या पूरी तरह से हम कह रहे हैं कि हम तुम्हारे साथ हैं. This is not the era of war. Sovereignty, territorial integrity must be respected. We are deeply concerned with the developments in Ukraine. We are talking to Ukrainian president also. ठीक है? Russia is also watching this. So, distrust in a traditional partnership may emerge, and the newer partnerships that we had developed now face the difficulty of being frozen where they stand. अभी तक जो progress किया, आगे progress मुश्किल हो जाएगी. ऐसा हो सकता है. So keeping this in mind, we will meet in the next class. We will simply wrap Russia with a simple dictation, and then the next thing that we will be talking about is Central Asia and Europe. Right? So that is the geography that we will be going in the next class. how India's, so that is China's project, but India is also interested in the Arctic. Are we an important country? Yes. Are we developing an Arctic policy? Yes. So how are we interested in the Arctic? Either for energy resources or for environmental reason, or if, let's say, the link between the Pacific and the Atlantic right now is the Indian Ocean. If that shifts, then Indian Ocean loses its relevance. All right. So if, say, let's say new trade route is emerging in the Pacific, we are far away in the Arctic, we are far away from the Arctic. And if China already has the lead and we have bad relations with China, we would be in a long-term disadvantageous position. So it's not that India is not looking to the north. It's a, as I said, it's a far-fetched future game. But if we are thinking of the future, that is the reality. All right. So Polar Silk Road is China's project. We are only indicating that how China may have a lead, a first start advantage when it comes to the Arctic. All right. And how then, if we are thinking of benefiting from Russia, that may not be as solid a proposition as we are thinking in the current scenario. पहले हम सोचते थे Arctic, Russia would be a partner. But if Russia and China get closer, and there is a polarization between West and the Russia-China bloc, then our choices even in the Arctic would become difficult, right, in terms of partnership and options.